Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fascinating. It's this intersection, where complex biological concepts meet these, bigger arguments about existence.
Right, the big question.
Exactly. And we're diving into a specific critique focusing on Professor John Lennox, the Oxford mathematician, and how he uses systems biology in these discussions. And this whole thing was actually sparked by a listener.
Oh, really?
Yeah, someone with a background in systems biology themselves who felt Professor Lennox's approach to their field was, misleading was the word they used.
Okay, interesting. So a critique from someone in the field, that gives it weight.
Definitely. So we've got source material from both sides here.
Right. We've got bits from a conversation with Professor Lennox himself where he touches on science, faith, biological complexity.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, this critique you mentioned from Dr. Jorge Pires, a systems biologist with a PhD.
That's the one.
Yeah.
So he takes significant issue with how Lennox frames these ideas.
Got it. So two distinct viewpoints on the same scientific area.
Exactly. So our mission really is to unpack Professor Lennox's arguments as presented, then look closely at the counter-arguments from Dr. Pires.
From that systems biology perspective.
Right. And hopefully pull out some insights for you, the listener, as you navigate these kinds of complex conversations.
Makes sense. Where should we start? With Lennox's points.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
So looking at the conversation source, Professor Lennox starts by suggesting science and religion, they aren't necessarily in conflict.
Okay. A common starting point for him, I think.
Yeah, and he actually links the rise of modern science itself to a Judeo-Christian worldview. He mentions figures like Galileo, Kepler, Newton.
Right. And he tends to frame the conflict not as science versus faith, but more as like competing worldviews. Theistic versus atheistic naturalism.
Precisely. He says you find scientists on both sides of that divide. But then his focus really sharpens onto biology, specifically macroevolution and critically the origin of life.
Ah, okay. Where he sees major problems for purely naturalistic explanations.
Yes. And this is where systems biology comes into his argument.
Right. He mentions developments in systems biology and points to Denis Noble.
The Oxford physiologist, yeah. A big name, a pioneer in systems biology.
Definitely.
Now here's where it gets really central to the critique. Lennox argues that the standard Darwinian mechanism, natural selection, random mutation, the neo-Darwinian idea.
Yeah, the textbook view for a long time.
He says it's being seriously questioned, that some, like Denis Noble, apparently view it as totally inadequate, even needing to be replaced.
Okay, that's a strong claim. Replaced, not just supplemented, but replaced.
That's the language used in the source, yeah. And he uses this chicken-the-egg problem analogy.
Right, the DNA and cell dependency. You need DNA for the cell, but the cell to make the DNA.
Exactly. And he suggests this kind of interdependence points towards what he calls top-down causation, something directing it.
I see. Implying an external organizing principle, perhaps?
That seems to be the implication. And he really emphasizes the sheer staggering complexity involved, especially DNA.
The linguistic complexity point.
Yeah, like a 3.4 billion letter word, he says, in this chemical alphabet, all needing to be in the right sequence.
And his argument there is that this level of specified information just couldn't arise randomly.
Pretty much. He says there's no chance of random processes generating that alone. He does acknowledge that someone like Richard Dawkins agrees natural selection isn't random selection.
Right. Selection is non-random, acting on random variation. That's the standard view.
But Lennox seems to be pushing back on whether the origin of that initial complex information can be explained without intelligence.
Okay. And it's not just DNA.
No, he talks about levels upon levels of complexity within the cell, like intricate chemical factories. And he feels this complexity, it sort of beggars into unbelief, the idea that no natural mechanisms could produce it. Without the input of intelligence. That's the phrase he uses.
And he uses the fact that we can't build these things as evidence.
Yeah. He says something like, we cannot build birds. We cannot build living cells.
Implying if human minds can't do it, natural processes certainly couldn't.
That seems to be the thrust. That it requires an intelligence beyond human capability and presumably beyond natural processes.
So, wrapping up his side from the source, the complexity, the origin of life problems, insights from systems biology. For him, they all point towards an intelligent cause.
Yes, and he frames it as the best explanation, explicitly trying to distance it from a simple God of the gaps.
Using that exit sign analogy.
Exactly. You see a sign, you know a mind made it. He argues that's inference based on experience, not just plugging a gap in knowledge.
Okay, a clear argument drawing on scientific observations to make a broader philosophical point.
Right. Now, let's switch gears to the critique. Dr. Jorge Guerra, the systems biologist.
The listener who sparked this deep dive, right? Well, the one whose critique the listener sent in.
Actually, the listener who sent it in has the background. Dr. Pires wrote the critique they shared. Apologies for the confusion there.
Ah, got it. Thanks for clarifying. So Dr. Pires, he hears Lennox mentioning systems biology, Dennis Noble.
And initially, he's intrigued. His own field being discussed.
Makes sense. What?
But according to the critique, that intrigue turned pretty quickly into, well, disappointment. Concern, even.
Why? What's the core issue he raises?
His main point is that Lennox's use of systems biology isn't really genuine scientific engagement. That's the claim.
Okay, how so? Not genuine.
He argues Lennox is basically philosophically repurposing its terminology, but stripping it of the actual scientific context.
So using the buzzwords without the substance. To make a theological point, the science itself doesn't actually support.
That's exactly the argument in the critique.
Okay, so if Lennox is getting it wrong, according to Pires, where does systems biology actually point? What's the scientific view?
Well, the critique does agree on one thing. Systems biology challenges that old-school simplistic reductionism.
The purely gene-centric view. Yeah, that's widely accepted now.
Right. And it acknowledges Dennis Noble's role in critiquing reductionism, emphasizing things like feedback loops, multi-level causation, emergence.
All standard concepts in systems biology, so that part's accurate.
That part, the critique says, is fine. But here's the crucial divergence.
Okay.
The critique asserts this shift towards complexity, towards systems thinking. It shows, well, not the necessity of God, but the sufficiency of networks.
The sufficiency of networks. Okay, that's the key phrase. Let's unpack that. What does that mean in practice?
It means looking at how these biological networks, genes, proteins interacting actually work. Systems biology uses math, computation to model this.
And what do these models show?
They reveal patterns, recurring structures called network motifs.
Like the example given in the critique, the FFL.
Exactly, the feed-forward loop. It's a specific wiring pattern, right? Where A affects B, and both A and B affect C.
Okay, and these aren't just random bits of wiring.
No, the critique argues they're highly functional. The FFL, for instance, can do things like precisely control the timing of gene expression, or filter out random noise in signals.
So sophisticated functions arising from the network structure itself.
Precisely. These are seen as emergent properties. The behavior arises from the interactions within the system.
Right, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, essentially.
Kind of. The critique says the FFL might look purposeful, giving that precise control, but it's entirely explainable through known biochemistry and evolutionary selection.
So order from interaction, not imposition. That's the counterargument.
Yes. The critique argues Lennox sees complexity and jumps to an external designer, missing what Pires sees as the core insight of systems biology. Sophisticated order can arise from the system itself, bottom up.
Okay, I see the clash clearly now. It's about the interpretation of where that observed order comes from.
Exactly. And the critique argues that Dennis Noble's actual work demonstrates this self-organizing dynamic.
Without needing a divine spark, as the critique puts it.
Right. Dr. Pires explicitly says he reread Noble's The Music of Life and found no mention of God or theological arguments.
So he feels citing Noble to imply naturalism has failed is
a distortion. Misleading. That's the claim in the critique.
What about Lennox's point about humans not being able to build a cell?
Yes, the critique tackles that head on, calls it a clear mistake. Because of synthetic biology, a field closely related to systems biology.
Which is actively trying to build life, or parts of it, from scratch.
Exactly. The critique states it's likely just a matter of time before humans create life from non-living components. And it points out our own cells use non-living stuff like salt anyway.
So the impossibility argument is factually questionable from that perspective.
According to the critique, yes. It characterizes Lennox's whole approach here as essentially a repackaged God of the gaps.
So the idea is find complexity or a gap in current scientific explanation and insert God there.
That's the accusation. But Pires counters that systems biology isn't a gap. It's a rigorous mathematical framework for explaining that complexity.
Using natural laws, network dynamics, emergence.
Right. and the ability to actually model these things, even design synthetic gene circuits that work. The critique argues this shows how, well, unnecessary invoking divine intervention is for biological explanation today.
So, the critique's bottom line is that Lennox uses the language and credibility of science,
but doesn't genuinely engage with the actual scientific, mathematical, experimental framework of systems biology.
and in doing so, misleads the audience about what the science says and co-opts names like Dennis Noble out of context.
That's the essence of the critique from Dr. Pires, yes.
Wow, it really is fascinating, isn't it, how you can have, well, ostensibly the same starting point biological complexity, the limits of old models,
Yeah, looking at the same intricate machinery of life, the same critiques of oversimplification.
and yet draw such radically different conclusions about what it all signifies.
It throws that whole role of worldview of your interpretive framework into really sharp relief, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because both sides, Lennox and Pires in this case, acknowledge the complexity. They both agree simple reductionism isn't the full picture.
But one sees that complexity, the information in DNA, the origin of life puzzle, as pointing beyond natural processes, towards intelligence. The best explanation, as Lennox puts it.
While the other sees that very same complexity as demonstrating the incredible power of natural processes, the sufficiency of networks, emergence, self-organization, and views the theological leap as, well, a misuse of the science.
Right, and this deep dive, spurred by that listener's concern and Dr. Pires' critique, hopefully gives you, the listener, a clearer picture of the specific debate.
It really highlights how important it is when you hear science being invoked in these bigger discussions to understand the nuances within the science itself.
Like the difference between scientists saying, our old model was too simple, we need systems thinking, versus saying, this complexity proves divine intervention. Those are very different claims.
Very different. And understanding that difference helps you evaluate the arguments more critically.
It's about being equipped to see how the scientific ideas are being framed and used.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the key takeaways then.
We explored Professor Lennox's argument, drawing on systems biology and complexity, things like DNA's linguistic nature, the cell's factory-like organization, the challenge of abiogenesis.
All presented as evidence pointing towards an intelligent designer, citing Dennis Noble's critiques of neo-Darwinism as supportive.
And then we look closely at the counter-critique from the systems biologist Dr. Pires,
Who argues this is a philosophical repurposing, a distortion even. That systems biology actually points to the power of natural networks and emergence.
Right, arguing that Noble's work doesn't support the theological conclusions drawn from it, and that fields like synthetic biology counter the impossibility claims.
Essentially framing Lennox's argument as a rebranded God of the Gaps, while systems biology offers a robust, naturalistic, explanatory framework.
It really drives home that appealing to science requires careful handling, doesn't it? Understanding the terms, the context, the actual scope of the scientific claims.
Absolutely. Which leads us to perhaps a final thought for you to mull over.
Okay.
When we encounter these incredibly complex scientific findings, things that genuinely push the boundaries of our current models, how do we distinguish? How do we discern between evidence that signals, okay, we need new scientific theories, new natural explanations, versus evidence that might genuinely point beyond science itself?
That's a tough question. Where's that line, and how do we know if or when it's been crossed? Something definitely worth thinking about.